Dr. Claire Evans tightened the knot of her ponytail as she studied the charts on the monitor. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the emergency room, mixing with the soft beeping of heart monitors and the occasional shuffle of nurses' shoes against the linoleum floor. It was past midnight, and the ER had finally slowed, but Claire's mind hadn't. She closed the chart and rubbed the tension building at her temples. Burning the midnight oil again? Dr. Nathan Reed leaned casually against the counter of the nurse's station, a cup of coffee in his hand and his ever-present smirk in place. Claire glanced at him but didn't respond. "You can't save them all, Evans." "I don't have to save them all," she said flatly. "Just the ones in front of me." Nathan shook his head. "You'll burn out, you know. This hospital doesn't reward martyrs. It rewards numbers." Before she could respond, her pager vibrated at her hip. "Trauma incoming." Claire was already moving. "We'll finish this later," she called back, her voice steady, but her hands already tingling with adrenaline. The automatic doors whooshed open as paramedics rushed through, wheeling in a stretcher. Rain dripped from their jackets, and puddles formed beneath their boots. Claire caught sight of the patient and froze for a fraction of a second. The man was filthy. Blood caked his shirt and streaked his face, but beneath the grime, his features hinted at someone far younger than she expected. Maybe mid-30s. His clothes were torn and soaked, his body limp as the paramedics struggled to stabilize him. "Collapsed in an alley," one of them said. "Unresponsive. He's tachycardic and hypotensive. We couldn't get much history." Claire leaned over him, pressing her fingers against his neck. Faint, thready pulse. His breathing was shallow, ribs barely moving. "We need to get him to surgery now," she said firmly. Nurse Rachel Adams appeared beside her. "Dr. Evans, he has no ID. No insurance." Claire's chest tightened. She didn't have time for protocols. "Prep him for surgery," she said, already moving toward the trauma bay. Rachel hesitated. The admin office already called down about cases like this. "Prep him." Claire snapped, louder this time. The nurses jumped into action. She knew the rules. The hospital had implemented stricter policies in recent months. No insurance meant limited care, and patients without identification were often turned away unless it was a clear-cut emergency. But Claire had taken an oath. The gurney rattled as it was pushed into the operating room. Claire followed, pulling on gloves and scrubbing in. Her heart pounded as the monitors beeped erratically. Inside the OR, Claire's focus narrowed. The rest of the world faded. She worked quickly, her hands steady despite the chaos unfolding around her. Blood pooled under the bright surgical lights, and for a moment, she feared the worst. "Clamp," she said. Rachel handed it over without a word. The team moved in perfect rhythm, and after what felt like hours but was only minutes, the bleeding slowed. The man's vitals began to stabilize. Claire finally allowed herself a breath, her pulse slowing as she stepped back from the table. She peeled off her gloves and mask, her hands trembling from the adrenaline crash. The patient was alive, for now. "Good work, Dr. Evans," Rachel said softly. Claire nodded, but the relief was short-lived. The door to the OR opened, and Nathan Reed stepped inside, his expression grim. "What the hell was that?" Claire frowned. "I just saved a man's life." "You just violated hospital protocol," Nathan said, lowering his voice but not the sharpness in his tone. "That man has no insurance. No ID. Admin's already been notified, and they're not happy." Claire crossed her arms. "So what? Was I supposed to let him die outside?" Nathan didn't flinch. "It's not about what you were supposed to do. It's about what you did. And what you did just signed your termination papers." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to protest, but Nathan was already walking out the door. Claire turned back to the patient, her chest tightening as she looked at his fragile, bandaged body. He was stable for now, but she knew her fight was far from over. Claire's footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as she left the operating room. Her pulse hadn't settled since Nathan's words, termination papers. The weight of it pressed against her chest, but her mind refused to stop replaying the moment when the man's pulse had steadied under her hands. She had done the right thing. Hadn't she? She pushed through the doors into the dimly lit recovery ward and found herself staring at him again. The man she'd risked everything for. He looked frail under the white sheets, his breathing shallow but steady. His face, now cleaned, showed signs of age that didn't match the broken state he'd been found in. "Who are you?" she murmured. The soft beep of the monitor was her only response. Rachel entered the room carrying a clipboard. "His vitals are holding steady. No signs of internal bleeding, but we'll need more tests once he's awake." Claire nodded, her thoughts still tangled. "Thanks, Rachel. I'll stay with him for a while." Rachel hesitated. Claire turned, already bracing herself. "The board's meeting tomorrow," Rachel said carefully. "Nathan's pushing hard for disciplinary action." Claire's stomach knotted. She expected as much. "Let them." Rachel's eyes softened. "You don't have to go through this alone, you know." Claire gave a small smile, but the words felt hollow. She was alone. The hospital's rules had made sure of that. Hours blurred as Claire watched over the man. She'd read every chart, reviewed every test, but there were still no answers about who he was. No ID. No reports of a missing person matching his description. When he finally stirred, Claire was on her feet instantly. "Hey," she said softly, leaning over the bed. His eyes fluttered open, blue, clear, and sharp. For a moment, they locked on hers, and she felt something stir, something unfamiliar. "Where am I?" His voice cracked, raw from dehydration. "You're at St. Vincent's Hospital. You were brought in last night. Do you remember what happened?" He tried to sit up, but the pain in his abdomen stopped him cold. Claire gently pushed him back. "Easy. You had surgery. You need to rest." He winced but settled against the pillows. His gaze scanned the room, wary and calculating. "What's your name?" she asked. His jaw tightened. "Sam." "Sam." Claire waited for more, but it didn't come. "Sam Bennett." It felt like he'd pulled the name from thin air, but Claire let it slide for now. "Sam, you were in bad shape when they brought you in. Internal bleeding, cracked ribs." His hand moved instinctively to his side. "How bad is it?" "You'll recover, but it's going to take time." Silence fell between them. Claire wanted to press him for more, how he ended up in that alley, why he had no ID, but his guarded expression warned her to tread carefully. "You shouldn't have helped me," he said suddenly. Claire blinked. "What?" "You should have let me go." Her pulse quickened. "Why would you say that?" He didn't answer, but his eyes gave him away. "Shame. Regret." Claire stepped closer. "Look, I don't know what's happened to you, but you're alive because someone believed your life was worth saving." Sam turned his head, avoiding her gaze. "And what did it cost you?" Her breath caught. Did he know? Could he sense it? "That's not your concern," she said firmly. "Focus on getting better." Before he could respond, the door creaked open. Nathan walked in, holding a clipboard like a weapon. "Claire," he said coolly. "We need to talk." "Not now." "Yes, now." Claire glanced at Sam, who was watching the exchange with sharp eyes. She followed Nathan into the hallway, shutting the door behind her. "You're being reckless," Nathan hissed. "The board is meeting in less than 12 hours, and I'm doing you a favor by letting you walk out of here with your license intact." "Don't push me." Claire straightened. "I saved his life, Nathan. Isn't that what we're supposed to do?" "Not when it puts this hospital at risk." Nathan's voice rose, but he quickly regained his composure. "This isn't personal, Claire. It's business." "No," she said quietly. "For you, it's business. For me, it's a promise." Nathan's lips pressed into a thin line. I hope it's worth it." He turned and left without another word. Claire leaned back against the wall, her hands shaking. She didn't know how this would end, but one thing was certain, she wasn't backing down. Claire sat at the kitchen table in her small apartment, staring blankly at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her. The ticking clock on the wall felt louder than usual, each second reminding her that her career, her entire life, was hanging by a thread. The board meeting was in 2 hours. She'd spent the morning pacing, rehearsing arguments in her head, but none of them seemed strong enough to counter hospital policy. Claire knew the odds were against her. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Rachel. "Are you coming in early? I can stall them if you need time." Claire hesitated before replying. "I'll be there." No stalling. She set the phone down and glanced at the pile of bills on the counter. Losing her job wouldn't just cost her a paycheck, it would cost her her identity. Saving people was what she did. Who was she without that? A knock at the door pulled her out of her spiral. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened it, Sam stood there, pale and leaning heavily against the frame. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharp with worry. "I checked myself out," he said, his voice hoarse. "You what?" "I couldn't stay there. Not after what I heard." Claire stepped aside to let him in, her mind racing. "You shouldn't be out of bed, let alone walking across town." Sam sank into a chair, wincing as he moved. "I had to see you. To say thank you." Claire softened, but only slightly. "You could have said that from a hospital bed." He smirked faintly. "Not really my style." Claire crossed her arms. "You're not making this easy for me." Sam looked up, his expression suddenly serious. "Neither are you." Her brow furrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I heard them talking about you. About firing you for what you did." Claire sighed, leaning back against the counter. "It's complicated." "No, it's not," he said, his voice stronger now. "You saved my life. You didn't think about rules or consequences. You just acted. And now they're punishing you for it." "That's how the world works," Claire said, her tone flat. "Then maybe it's time someone changed the world." She met his gaze, surprised at the determination she saw there. "You don't even know me," she said quietly. "I know enough," he replied. Silence filled the room until Claire finally broke it. "You're not as broken as you want people to think you are." Sam flinched but didn't argue. Instead, he looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers like he wasn't used to feeling them. "Look," Claire said, softening. "You need to rest, and I need to figure out how to keep my job." Sam stood, slower this time. "And I need to figure out how to repay you. You don't owe me anything." "That's where you're wrong." Before she could argue, he walked out the door, leaving Claire standing there with more questions than answers. The boardroom smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Claire sat at the far end of the long, polished table, surrounded by administrators who avoided eye contact. Nathan sat closest to the head of the table, flipping through a folder with deliberate slowness. "We all know why we're here," he began, closing the folder. Dr. Evans violated clear hospital policy by treating an undocumented patient without approval. Claire kept her shoulders back, refusing to let him see her nerves. "I didn't violate my oath," she said, her voice steady. "Your oath doesn't pay the bills," Nathan shot back. "It wasn't about money," Claire snapped. "It was about saving a life." "Dr. Evans." She cut him off. "If I hadn't acted, he would have died. And we'd be sitting here discussing a lawsuit instead of an ethical decision." Nathan's jaw tightened, but the room shifted. She could feel it. "We can't operate on feelings," one of the board members said cautiously. "Then what's the point of any of this?" Claire shot back. "If we're not here to help people, then what are we doing?" Silence filled the room, but Claire knew it wasn't victory. It was hesitation. "We'll deliberate," the chairman finally said. "You'll have our decision by the end of the day." Claire stepped outside into the parking lot, her lungs tightening as the cool air hit her. She'd said what she needed to, but it didn't feel like enough. Her phone buzzed again. "Rachel. They're taking this upstairs. The hospital board wants to make an example out of you." Claire's grip tightened around the phone. "I'll handle it." She hung up and looked out over the empty lot. Somewhere out there, Sam was walking around, carrying his own battle scars. And for the first time in hours, Claire felt less alone. Claire leaned against the counter in her kitchen, staring at the faint reflection of herself in the window. The hospital's decision still hadn't come through, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. She replayed the boardroom meeting over and over, trying to convince herself that her words had made a difference. But the truth was, she wasn't sure. Her thoughts shifted to Sam, his guarded expression, the way he'd looked at her like she was the first person to believe in him in a long time. She shook her head. She didn't have time to worry about him. She had to figure out her next move. Her phone vibrated, breaking the silence. Unknown caller. She hesitated before answering. "Hello? It's me." Claire's pulse quickened. "Sam?" "Yeah." His voice was quieter than before, hesitant. I need your help." "Where are you?" He gave her an address, and Claire grabbed her coat without thinking twice. When she arrived, the neighborhood was darker than she'd expected, the kind of place where broken streetlights and graffiti-covered walls told stories no one wanted to hear. She found Sam sitting on the steps of a crumbling building, his arms wrapped tightly around himself. He looked worse than when he'd left the hospital, pale, sweat glistening on his forehead. "You're burning up," she said, crouching in front of him. "You shouldn't have left." "I didn't have a choice," he muttered. Claire reached out, but he flinched. She froze, her eyes scanning his face. "Sam, what's going on?" He swallowed hard, looking away. "You wouldn't understand. Try me." For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, finally, he rolled up his sleeve. Claire's breath caught. Track marks lined the inside of his arm, faded scars mixed with fresher ones. Her stomach sank. "Sam. I told you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You should have let me go." Claire's mind raced. She'd worked with addicts before. She knew the signs, the cycles, the excuses. But this felt different. "You don't get to give up," she said firmly. "Not after everything I risked to keep you alive." His eyes snapped to hers, anger flashing briefly before it faded. "You don't know what it's like." "No," she admitted. "But I know what it looks like to fight. And I see that in you." Sam let out a shaky breath, leaning back against the steps. "I used to be someone," he said quietly. "Someone people looked up to. But one bad decision, one bad day, and it all fell apart." Claire sat beside him, waiting. "I was a surgeon," he finally said. "Top of my class. Fast track to chief resident." Then, he paused, his voice cracking. "I lost my wife and daughter in a car accident. I was supposed to be driving that night. But I stayed late at the hospital. I thought saving strangers was more important than being home." Claire's heart twisted. "I tried to keep going," he continued. "Tried to bury myself in work. But every surgery, every patient reminded me of what I'd lost. I started using to numb it. At first, it was just to take the edge off. Then it wasn't." He wiped at his eyes roughly. "They found me passed out in the OR. License revoked. Career over. And now, this." Claire reached for his hand, and this time he didn't pull away. "You're not that man anymore," she said softly. He let out a bitter laugh. "A homeless junkie? Pretty sure I am." "No," she said firmly. "You're not. You're still here. That means there's something worth fighting for." Sam looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something, hope, maybe. But before she could say more, her phone buzzed. A text from Rachel. Decision's in. Call me ASAP. Claire's stomach dropped. She stood, her heart pounding. I have to go, she said, her voice tight. But I'll be back. You're not alone in this. Sam nodded, but the fear in his eyes lingered as she walked away. Claire sat in her car outside the hospital, staring at the text and willing herself to breathe. Her hands trembled as she dialed Rachel's number. Tell me, Claire said the moment Rachel picked up. Rachel's voice was calm but edged with regret. It's bad, Claire. They voted to terminate your contract. The words hit like a slap. Effective immediately, Rachel continued. I'm so sorry. Claire barely heard the rest of what Rachel said. The world blurred as reality sank in. Her career was over. She hung up without saying goodbye, staring out at the lights of the hospital that had been her home for years. For the first time, she let herself feel the weight of everything she'd lost. But somewhere in the back of her mind, she saw Sam's face, and that flicker of hope, and it was enough to make her wipe her tears and start the car. Claire sat in her car long after the hospital disappeared in her rearview mirror. The glow of the streetlights blurred as tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. Breaking down wasn't an option. Not now. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as her thoughts raced. Everything she'd worked for was gone, her job, her reputation, and maybe even her career. Yet, as the shock settled, another thought surfaced. Sam. His story replayed in her mind, the scars, the guilt, the pain he carried. She couldn't save her job, but maybe she could save him. The resolution steadied her hands. She started the car and drove straight to the shelter where she'd dropped him off earlier. When Claire stepped inside, the dim lights flickered, and the air smelled faintly of bleach. A tired-looking woman at the front desk gave her a skeptical glance. I'm looking for Sam Bennett, Claire said. The woman scanned the sign-in sheet and shook her head. He left an hour ago. Claire's stomach dropped. Did he say where he was going? Sorry, no. Claire hurried back to her car, her pulse quickening. She checked her phone, scrolling through messages she knew wouldn't be there. Then she remembered the crumbling building where she'd found him earlier. She drove faster than she should have, her headlights slicing through the dark. When she pulled up to the building, it was quiet, too quiet. Sam, she called as she stepped inside the shadowy entrance. No answer. Her heart pounded as she climbed the stairs, the creaks beneath her feet echoing. When she reached the second floor, she saw him slumped against the wall. Sam. Claire rushed to his side. His breathing was shallow, and his skin was clammy. She checked his pulse, weak but steady. Stay with me, she whispered, pulling out her phone to call for help. His eyes fluttered open. Don't, he rasped. Don't what? You need a hospital. No hospitals, he said, his voice barely audible. They'll put me back in the system. Claire froze, the weight of his words sinking in. She didn't know what he was running from, but this wasn't just about addiction or guilt. Then let me help you here, she said, forcing calm into her voice. She dragged him to his feet, guiding him to a makeshift cot in the corner of the room. His body was frail, and she could feel the tremors as she helped him sit down. Why are you doing this? He asked, his voice cracking. Claire met his gaze. Because I believe in second chances. Even if you don't. Sam let out a bitter laugh, but it quickly turned into a wince. Claire didn't flinch. She cleaned his arm with supplies from the first aid kit she'd grabbed from her car, her hands steady even as her thoughts swirled. She needed to know more about him, about the past that haunted him, but she knew pushing too hard might drive him away. Instead, she focused on stabilizing him, watching as the tension in his body began to ease. You said you were a surgeon, she finally said, breaking the silence. Sam didn't respond at first, but then he nodded. What happened? He let out a slow breath. I lost everything. You told me about the accident, Claire said gently. But what happened after? Sam stared at the ceiling, his voice distant. I spiraled. Drugs numbed the pain, but they also stole everything else. My job. My reputation. My self-respect. Claire hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging at her. But how did you end up on the streets? Someone with your skills, there had to be people who wanted to help. His eyes darkened. There were. But I didn't want their help. I didn't think I deserved it. Claire sat back, absorbing his words. She understood guilt. She'd felt it every time she lost a patient, every time bureaucracy got in the way of saving a life. But Sam's guilt ran deeper, more corrosive. You deserve it now, she said firmly. Sam shook his head. You don't get it. They'll never let me come back, not after what I did. Claire leaned forward. Then we fight. Together. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something, hope, maybe. But before she could say more, her phone buzzed. A text from Rachel. Rumors spreading fast. Board's decision already made the rounds. Claire's chest tightened, but she forced herself to focus. Sam needed her now, and she wasn't about to let him down. Claire paced the length of Sam's makeshift shelter, her phone still in her hand. Rachel's text echoed in her mind. The board's decision already made the rounds. She could almost hear Nathan's voice announcing her termination to the staff, his words sharp and calculated. But right now, that didn't matter. Sam mattered. She turned to find him sitting on the cot, looking far more alert than he had an hour ago. His color had improved slightly, but his eyes still held shadows. You're going to need more than bandages and pep talks to get through this, she said. Sam tilted his head, studying her. And what exactly are you offering? A plan, Claire replied without hesitation. Step 1, you get clean. Step 2, we fix your reputation. His laugh was hollow. Fix it? Claire, they don't fix people like me. They bury us. No, she stepped closer. You buried yourself. It's time to dig back out. For a moment, Sam looked like he might argue, but then he slumped forward, his elbows on his knees. And what about you? You're risking everything. For what? Claire crossed her arms. For the same reason I became a doctor in the first place, because people deserve a chance to fight for their lives. Even you. Her words hung in the air, and Sam finally looked up, something shifting in his expression. Okay, he said quietly. I'll try. The next few days passed in a blur. Claire moved Sam into a small spare room she used for storage, cleared out boxes, and set up a cot. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe. She monitored his withdrawal symptoms closely, keeping him hydrated and as comfortable as possible. Nights were the hardest. She'd sit by his side as he fought through the worst of it, talking him down from panic attacks and nightmares. One night, as the tremors began to subside, Sam broke the silence. I don't deserve this, he murmured. Claire didn't look away from his hand, which she held firmly. You don't get to decide that. He closed his eyes, and she stayed with him until he fell asleep. By the end of the week, Sam was stronger. His appetite returned, and his color improved. He even managed to shower and shave, and when Claire saw him step out of the bathroom, she was struck by how different he looked. You clean up well, she teased. He smirked, running a hand through his damp hair. Thanks. It's been a while. Her smile faded as she sat at the kitchen table, folders and papers spread out in front of her. We need to talk about your past, she said. Sam stiffened. People are going to ask questions, and we need answers. Not excuses, answers. Sam exhaled slowly and sat across from her. You said you were a surgeon, Claire began. Where? Chicago Memorial, he replied. Cardiothoracic. Claire raised her eyebrows. That's impressive. Was. And the accident? Was it really your fault? Sam's eyes darkened. No. But that didn't stop me from believing it was. Claire nodded. And your license? Can we get it back? Sam hesitated. Not easily. It's been suspended indefinitely. Claire tapped the table. Then we give them a reason to reconsider. Sam frowned. Claire. No, she interrupted. You're not done, Sam. You just need someone to remind you of that. He stared at her, and for the first time, she saw something besides guilt. Determination. They spent the next few days preparing. Claire reached out to old contacts while Sam worked on his story, practicing how he'd answered difficult questions about his past. But the real test came when Claire arranged a meeting with Eric Matthews, a journalist known for covering medical controversies. This could backfire, Sam said as they waited for Eric at a quiet cafe. It won't, Claire replied, though her hands betrayed her, trembling slightly around her coffee cup. When Eric arrived, his sharp eyes moved between them as he set down his recorder. Dr. Evans, he began, you've made quite a name for yourself recently. Care to tell me why you're risking your career for him? Claire straightened. Because he's worth it. And because the system is broken. Eric leaned back, intrigued. And you, Sam? Why come forward now? Sam hesitated but then squared his shoulders. Because I'm ready to stop hiding. By the time the interview ended, Claire felt lighter, as though they'd finally taken a step towards something bigger. But as they left the cafe, Sam's phone buzzed, a number he didn't recognize. He answered cautiously. Dr. Bennett, a voice said. Sam froze. It had been years since anyone called him that. Yes? This is Dr. Harris from the State Medical Board. We received a request for your file. If you're serious about reinstatement, we need to meet. Sam hung up and turned to Claire, disbelief written all over his face. What is it? She asked. They're willing to talk. Claire grinned. Then let's make sure they listen. Sam stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his shirt for what felt like the 100th time. The man staring back at him looked foreign, clean-shaven, hair-combed, and dressed in a crisp button-down. But the eyes were the same, haunted and uncertain. Claire appeared in the doorway, holding a folder. You look like a doctor again. He gave a weak smile. I don't feel like one. Claire stepped closer, placing the folder on the table. Then let's remind them who you really are. Sam ran his hands through his hair, nerves making his stomach twist. And what if it's not enough? What if they see the addict and not the surgeon? Then we fight harder, Claire said firmly. But you're not walking in there alone. Sam took a deep breath and nodded. The conference room at the State Medical Board's office was sterile, all polished wood and muted tones. Claire and Sam sat across from three board members whose expressions gave nothing away. Dr. Harris, the man who'd called, cleared his throat. Dr. Bennett, I appreciate you coming in today. We've reviewed your case, and while your past raises significant concerns, we also can't ignore your prior contributions to the field. Sam's palms were sweaty, but he kept his voice steady. I made mistakes. I let grief control my life, and I allowed it to destroy my career. But I'm not that man anymore. I've been clean for months, and I'm ready to prove that I deserve a second chance. One of the board members, a stern-looking woman, leaned forward. Prove it how? Sam hesitated, and Claire jumped in. He's already started. Sam has been volunteering with underprivileged communities, providing care where it's needed most. The woman raised an eyebrow. Is that true? Yes, Sam said, gaining confidence. And I plan to continue, whether my license is reinstated or not. The room fell silent. The board members exchanged glances, and Dr. Harris finally spoke. We'll deliberate and get back to you with our decision. As they left the building, Sam exhaled sharply. That wasn't terrible, right? Claire smiled. It was more than enough. A week later, Claire found herself pacing outside the door of a community center where Sam was helping at a health clinic. The call from the board had come in earlier that morning, but she hadn't wanted to tell him over the phone. Inside, she saw him crouched next to a little girl, wrapping a bandage around her knee. Her mother looked ungratefully as Sam gave the girl a sticker and a smile. "Sam," Claire called softly. He looked up, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. "Hey! What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said quickly, holding out the letter. "It's from the board." His face fell, and Claire's heart squeezed. "Open it," she urged. Sam tore open the envelope, scanning the words inside. His hands trembled slightly as he reached the final paragraph. "They approved it," he whispered. Claire's grin broke through. "They what?" "They're reinstating my license. Probationary at first, but I'm back." The mother he'd been helping clapped, and Sam laughed, really laughed, for the first time since Claire had met him. She didn't expect the hug that followed, but she returned it without hesitation. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For not giving up on me." Claire blinked away the sudden tears and stepped back. "Now don't make me regret it." Later that night, Claire sat across from Sam at her kitchen table. The relief was still fresh, but she knew the fight wasn't over. "They're going to watch your every move," she said. "One misstep." "There won't be any," Sam interrupted. "Not this time." She studied him carefully, seeing the conviction in his eyes. "Good." He leaned back, a small smile playing at his lips. "So what's next for you, Dr. Evans?" "You can't exactly go back to St. Vincent's." Claire shrugged. "I don't know. But helping you made me realize something. I don't need a big hospital to make a difference." Sam's expression softened. "Whatever you decide, you won't be doing it alone." Claire smiled. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that things might actually be okay. Claire stood at the edge of the crowded hall, her hands nervously smoothing the hem of her blazer. The community center buzzed with energy, volunteers setting up tables, patients waiting to be seen, and Sam moving from one station to the next like he'd never stepped away from medicine. It was the first free clinic they'd organized together, and though Claire felt a swell of pride watching it unfold, the weight of everything they'd been through still lingered. "You're overthinking again," Sam said, appearing at her side. Claire smirked. "Says the guy who spent 15 minutes practicing how to introduce himself this morning." He chuckled. "Touché." Her smile faded as she looked out at the crowd. "Do you think this will be enough? I mean, to keep you on the right track?" Sam followed her gaze. "It's not just about me anymore, Claire. It's about them." Before she could respond, the front doors burst open, and Eric Matthews, the journalist who had first covered their story, walked in with a cameraman in tow. "You ready for this?" Eric asked, holding up his microphone. Claire exchanged a glance with Sam. "As ready as we'll ever be." The interview started smoothly. Eric asked about the clinic, their goals, and how they hoped to provide care to those who had nowhere else to go. But Claire knew the harder questions were coming. "Sam," Eric began, leaning in slightly. "You've had quite a journey, from a rising star in surgery to losing everything and now clawing your way back. What's been the hardest part?" Sam hesitated. "Believing I deserved a second chance." Claire felt a lump rise in her throat as Sam continued. "There were days I didn't think I'd make it, nights I hoped I wouldn't. But then someone saw me, not for my failures, but for the man I could be again. And that made all the difference." Eric nodded. "What do you say to critics who believe someone with your past shouldn't be allowed back in the medical field?" Sam's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "I say I'm not the same man who lost everything. I've learned from my mistakes. And I've seen firsthand what it's like to be on the other side, to be the one in need. That's something most doctors can't say." Claire watched as the tension in the room shifted. People were listening. After the interview wrapped, Claire stepped outside for air, her pulse still racing. "You did good in there," Sam said, joining her. "Yeah? Well, it's not over yet." He leaned against the wall, hands in his pockets. "You're always thinking 10 steps ahead. Someone has to." Sam tilted his head, studying her. "And what happens when this is done? When the clinic's up and running and you're back to saving everyone else?" Claire opened her mouth, but no words came. He nodded. Exactly. You need to think about what you want, Claire. Not just what everyone else needs from you. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize. Hello? Dr. Evans? This is Margaret Reed from St. Vincent's. Claire froze. Nathan's boss. I wanted to inform you that the board has revisited your case in light of recent developments. Claire's breath caught. And? We'd like to offer you reinstatement, with full privileges. The words hit her like a punch, unexpected and overwhelming. Why now? She managed. Your story has gained traction, Margaret admitted. And frankly, the hospital can't ignore the positive attention. We think this could be a fresh start for everyone. Claire swallowed hard. I need time to think about it. Of course. Let us know soon. She hung up and turned to find Sam watching her. What was that? Claire hesitated. They offered me my job back. Sam's face was unreadable. And? I don't know. He stepped closer. Yes, you do. Claire looked up at him, her chest tightening. I fought so hard to get here, to earn their respect. But this, the clinic, it feels right in a way the hospital never did. Sam smiled softly. Then there's your answer. Later that night, Claire sat at her kitchen table, staring at the job offer on her phone. She thought about the nights spent at the hospital, the endless shifts, the battles with administrators. It was safe. It was familiar. But then she thought about the people she'd met at the clinic, the ones who couldn't afford a doctor, who had nowhere else to go. And she thought about Sam, the man who reminded her that healing wasn't just about saving lives. It was about believing they were worth saving in the first place. She picked up her phone and dialed Margaret's number. Thank you, she said when Margaret answered. But I'm moving in a different direction. Claire hung up and exhaled deeply. It wasn't fear she felt anymore. It was freedom. The next morning, Claire and Sam stood outside the clinic as patients lined up at the door. You ready? Sam asked. More than ready, Claire replied. Sam grinned. Good. Because this is just the beginning. And as Claire looked out at the crowd, she knew he was right. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the clinic's modest lobby. Claire stood at the front desk, organizing patient files while the hum of conversation filled the room. The space wasn't flashy, just a repurposed community center with folding chairs and borrowed medical equipment, but it was alive. And it was hers. Dr. Evans, Rachel called from the door, waving a clipboard. We've got 2 walk-ins and a follow-up for Sam. Claire smiled. I'll take the walk-ins. Send Sam my way when he's done. Rachel grinned and disappeared down the hall. It had been 2 weeks since Claire turned down St. Vincent's offer. 2 weeks of late nights, early mornings, and moments where she questioned whether she'd made the right decision. But standing here now, watching patients get the care they needed, she knew she had. Sam stepped into her office a half hour later, his hair still damp from washing up between patients. He looked healthier than she'd ever seen him, clear-eyed, steady, and sharp in the borrowed scrubs they'd managed to track down. You're becoming a regular around here, Claire teased as he sat across from her. Don't get used to it, he replied, but there was warmth in his voice. How's the shoulder? Claire asked, motioning to the sling he'd finally shed. Good as new. I'm even thinking about starting up morning runs again. Claire arched an eyebrow. Don't push your luck. He laughed, leaning back in his chair. You worry too much. Someone has to, she said. Sam's expression shifted, his tone softening. And what about you? How are you holding up? Claire hesitated, her fingers tapping lightly against her desk. Honestly, I haven't had time to think about it. Sam studied her for a moment. You should. What's that supposed to mean? It means, he said, leaning forward, you spend so much time fixing everyone else that you forget you need fixing too. Claire opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. He wasn't wrong. Later that afternoon, Claire stepped outside for some air. The crowd at the clinic had finally thinned, and the sun was beginning its slow descent. Sam joined her a few minutes later, a cup of coffee in each hand. "Peace offering," he said, handing her one. She took it with a grateful smile. "I didn't know we were fighting." "Not yet," he joked, but then his expression turned serious. "You ever think about what's next?" Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" "For the clinic," he clarified. "We're doing good work here, but it's small. What happens when we outgrow this space? When more people need us?" Claire sipped her coffee, her thoughts swirling. It wasn't the first time the question had crossed her mind. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we'll figure it out." Sam nodded, but she could see the wheels turning in his head. "You're not planning something crazy, are you?" He smirked. "Define crazy." Claire shook her head, but she couldn't hide the small smile tugging at her lips. The day wound down as the last patients left, and Claire sat at her desk, staring at the paperwork in front of her. Despite the long hours, exhaustion didn't feel as heavy as it used to. Sam knocked on the doorframe, leaning in. "Heading out?" "In a minute," she replied. He hesitated before stepping inside. "You know, I was thinking about what you said earlier. About figuring things out as we go." Claire looked up. And maybe we don't have to do it alone." She tilted her head. "I thought we weren't fighting." Sam smiled. "We're not. I just mean, this place, this work, it's bigger than us now. People are paying attention. We need help if we're going to keep up." Claire exhaled. "You're right." His eyebrows lifted. "Did you just say that out loud?" "Don't get used to it," she shot back. They both laughed, but Claire's mind was already spinning with possibilities. By the time she locked up the clinic for the night, Claire felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. She looked back at the building, small but steady, and let herself believe that it was just the beginning. Sam stood by her car, waiting. "You ready?" he asked. Claire nodded. "More than ready." And as they drove away, Claire knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the fight. Claire stood in the middle of the clinic's lobby, her arms crossed as she watched volunteers set up tables and chairs. The buzz of anticipation filled the air as patients began trickling in, their faces reflecting everything from hope to uncertainty. Today wasn't just another day, it was the grand reopening of the clinic under its new name, Second Chances Health Center. Sam appeared beside her, dressed in his scrubs and adjusting a clipboard. "You sure you don't want to say a few words before we start?" Claire smirked. "You mean a speech?" "I think I'll pass." He arched an eyebrow. "You're going to have to get used to attention, Claire. People are looking at you now, not just as a doctor, but as a leader." She exhaled, the weight of his words sinking in. It was true. Since the media had picked up their story, donations had poured in, and the clinic had grown faster than she'd expected. They'd hired more staff, expanded their services, and most importantly, earned the trust of the community. Still, Claire wasn't one for spotlights. "You do the talking," she said, giving him a playful nudge. "I'll be the one saving lives." Sam shook his head but didn't push further. Instead, he glanced at the crowd gathering outside. "We should get started." The day passed in a whirlwind. Patients came and went, leaving behind gratitude and stories that reminded Claire why she'd chosen this path. One woman, a single mother of 3, hugged Claire tightly after receiving an ultrasound she couldn't afford anywhere else. An elderly man with diabetes left with tears in his eyes, thanking her for simply listening to him after years of feeling ignored by the system. And then there was a young boy with a broken arm, who lit up as Sam wrapped his cast and promised it would heal stronger than before. Claire watched Sam carefully throughout the day. He moved with confidence, the hesitation of their early days gone. It wasn't just the patients he was saving, it was himself. As the last patient left, Claire leaned against the desk, letting the exhaustion sink in. Rachel handed her a bottle of water, grinning. Not bad for day one, Rachel said. Not bad at all. Sam joined them, flipping through charts. We're booked solid for the next 2 weeks. Claire raised an eyebrow. Good thing you didn't run off after getting your license back. He laughed. And miss this? Not a chance. Rachel's phone buzzed, and she stepped away, leaving Claire and Sam alone in the quiet. You did it, Sam said softly, leaning against the counter. Claire tilted her head. We did it. Sam smiled, but then his expression turned serious. You're not afraid, are you? That this might be too much? Claire hesitated, then shook her head. No. For the first time, I'm not afraid at all. Later that night, Claire locked up the clinic and stood outside, looking up at the sign above the door. Second Chances Health Center. The name felt right, like it had always been meant to be. Sam walked up beside her, shoving his hands into his pockets. You ever think about how far we've come? Claire smiled. All the time. Do you ever regret it? She looked at him, surprised. Not for a second. He nodded, but there was something in his eyes, an uncertainty she hadn't seen in weeks. What's on your mind? She asked. He hesitated. I never thought I'd get this far. Sometimes it feels like I'm still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Claire reached out, resting a hand on his arm. That's not who you are anymore, Sam. You're here. You're doing this. And you're not alone. He smiled, and for once, it didn't feel forced. The next morning, Claire stood in front of a crowded hall as Sam finished giving his speech. She hadn't planned to talk, but when Sam turned the microphone toward her, something inside her shifted. She stepped forward, clearing her throat. When I started this journey, I thought I'd lost everything, she began. My career, my reputation, my purpose. She glanced at Sam, who gave her an encouraging nod. But what I found was something better. I found that purpose isn't tied to a title or a paycheck. It's tied to the people we choose to show up for, day after day, even when it's hard. She looked out at the audience, feeling the weight of her words settle over them. This clinic isn't just a building. It's a promise. A promise that no one is beyond saving, no matter their past. And it's a reminder that second chances aren't given, they're earned. The room erupted into applause, and Claire felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, peace. As the event wrapped up, Sam walked up to her, shaking his head. I thought you didn't do speeches. She smirked. Don't get used to it. He laughed, but then his expression softened. Thank you for believing in me when no one else did. Claire squeezed his hand. Thank you for proving me right. That evening, Claire sat in her office, staring out the window as the city lights flickered. The fight wasn't over. There would be more battles, more challenges. But for the first time, she felt ready. Ready to face whatever came next. Because this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.